And you spoiled the end. You gave the ending of this 65-year-old story away. And so in the middle of this, with Superman being popular, Batman being popular, Captain America, as well as suddenly it's the era of the superhero. This is the dawn of that age. And so the syndicate they wanted a superhero, and they made Eisner, I think, was looking to explore new horizons like he always was. And he saw this because Eisner and Iger was doing fine packaging all sorts of comics for all sorts of companies. And Eisner let himself be bought out by Jerry Iger. And he went into this business of creating this 16-page comic insert. It was the Spirit with several other backups that he supervised. And this was a big risk, but with the potential of a big payoff. The Spirit did well. Let's say it was in 22 papers, which, when you look at something like Little Abner being in 400 papers or whatever, I mean, it never achieved that level, but it was a comic, but it's still, since everybody read newspapers, it still had a potential audience of 5 million people who bought these papers. And it established Eisner as kind of the artist, the guy this is a little crude. This is the first appearance of the Spirit. But as we'll see, his style and his approach in both layout and design and inking and penciling and even, the writing and the lettering. Let's see the next one.
Yeah,
You
there we
can
go.
see even just like a month later in July, already this sense of design and the fact there was no regular Spirit logo for the first few years, which I think drove the syndicate crazy because they didn't have anything they could trademark. But because Will had this double challenge, it was a 16-page insert without a cover, so he had a limited amount of real estate, and he had to grab people's attention. So he developed this way of making the Spirit splash pages eye-catching and beautifully designed. So this is what Jules Pfeiffer and a lot of people call the pre-war Spirit, which is a little more serious in tone. You'll see some of the later stuff is a little more kind of Bigfoot cartoony in some way without sacrificing the layouts. So these are more like what you would think of film noir. But next, please. And we saw this early on. This is one of the most memorable ones. This is the only Spirit section I own. A couple of years ago in San Diego, I was able to find a beat up copy for a ridiculously low price, seemed to me. But I mean, and Eisner here, it's 1940. This is 23-year-old Will Eisner running a whole studio, putting out 16 pages a week, which is 64 pages a month of comics with and doing the strip and probably doing some packaging on the side as well. I think he always was doing some other stuff. So he had no social. When people ask him, how did you do all that work? He said, well, I didn't have a girlfriend back then. That was his, and he had a lot of, again, he had a lot of assistants, Pfeiffer a little later than this, but, Lou Fine and Jack Cole and just everybody who was anybody in comics went through and apprenticed with Will. So next, please. And this is Will did get drafted because it was on Pearl Harbor is the day after Pearl Harbor is when America entered World War II in earnest. And Will served stateside doing instructional and propaganda material and newspaper material. So he was stateside, but I think he was so busy with the Army stuff. I don't think he did much. I think Stan there were other artists who were able at points to mail in or find time to do comics work. I don't think Will did much of that during the war. I think he mostly left the Spirit and whatever else he was doing in other people's hands. So there's Will in the Army next. That is, he was at the Aberdeen Proving Grounds, which I guess, according to this is in Maryland. So I guess that was, I'm not sure exactly what it was. I guess it's an ordnance training center. But Will was the editor and the cartoonist of their newspaper. So he did a lot of work on that. And as you can see, there's some, definitely that illustration in the top right, we're 1 year old today. Even from a distance, you can see that's a Will Eisner drawing. Next, please. And he also started doing these instructional manuals for military vehicles, and as well as later on for weapons. This was Army Motors, which he packaged and edited while in the Army, and then afterwards as well. Next.
I see it. I see the start of his cartoony style.
Oh yeah, yeah. Well, maybe that's, and this is really with this character Joe Dope. I think even then Dope had a little bit of a drug double meaning, but mostly meant, I think it came to mean somebody who was stupid or brain addled, probably because of having taken drugs, but somehow they became synonymous. Yeah, it's got that look of the later. I think Eisner must have figured if he was trying to do material for people in combat, or even if they weren't in combat in the Army who were not happy about being there, then he had to lighten it up. And also, as you can see next, right. I mean, these pilots will gently explain to Joe Dope what occurs in the plane. When a poor little J lets the oil leak away, so the gun blows the back plate in plane. I mean, Will was actually proud all through his career with the military, that he felt that his work saved lives. That through these instructional manuals, he was able to keep people from having their weapons blow up literally in their faces and kill or maim them. He never was super political, I mean, and he continued doing it up through Vietnam. Well, I don't know if that implies feeling one way or the other about that war, but this was like I said, he was very proud that that lives were saved, at least from malfunctioning equipment. This got him, as you would imagine, in the 60s and the underground days. I think this got him some sideways looks from underground cartoonists and hippie cartoonists who were totally anti-Vietnam War, and some of them pacifists or whatever. I think this made for an uncomfortable period. Although I think everybody made up and became friends later. Next, please. And this, I guess I didn't, but Will also drew in a lot of those manuals, a lot of sexy women, which to keep the attention. So I guess I don't have that in this presentation, but after the war, Will came back to the spirit, and, he seemed changed, even though he hadn't literally seen combat. I think he just grew and matured and saw a lot and learned a lot. And he took the spirit to another level. This has a look more of the pre-war spirit, actually, even though it's from 1946. There's some of that, I don't know if that's the most complimentary portrayal of an Asian woman. I think Pigalle, who's actually named after the red light district in Paris, or it had been the red light district, or the Pigalle, later became, I think, less Asian looking and more Caucasian looking. But the layout and the tone of this, you can see this is that Eisner's work, and the spirit, it's almost, it's emblematic. The spirit actually, in many of his stories, wasn't in a lot of the pages. He was almost a supporting character. So he almost is here. Pigalle is clearly the focus, but the spirit kind of is watching. Next, please.
It's not the worst depiction of an Asian woman.
True. So Eisner, aside from the story, so he had to put out. He was very influenced by short story writers like Guy de Maupassant and O. Henry, Stories with surprise endings, and of course by the film noir of the era and every other genre. But this is pretty amazing from 1949. He takes, still insisting on doing something crazy with the logo every week. Here, the logo becomes a building. That's pretty astonishing.
Yeah.
Nick. So I'm just going to go through a couple of these splash pages. We can go through these relatively quickly.
I love this one.
Well, this is the Spirit really
Yeah.
looking like Victor Mature. If you have any Victor
Yeah.
Mature. No, it's brilliant. I mean, there's the rain coming down on the lamp outside the classic old time police station light fixture. You just feel like you're right in there with them, but aside from the Spirit just looking cool, there's something going on in the background with Dolan and a kid named Sammy. Next, please. These were originally printed in color, but over the years they've been reprinted in black and white, and some of them just work as well or better in black and white. This is one called Black Alley. We'll see it. I mean, just the perspective on this. Holy cow!
It's great.
And I mean, it's informed. You can tell that this guy grew up in the tenements in the Bronx, right by the subway. Because I don't care how good your reference is, you can't draw that without living it. Next
It looks like he eyeballed the perspective too.
Probably. Well, I don't think he was up in a helicopter,
Yeah.
And I don't think there were any. This is another one, Life Below. We can go through these.
Love it.
This is Man Ray, who was a big influence on Eisner. He was what would you call him? Surrealist? What was the movement he was in? Dada. I guess he was more in the Dada movement.
Probably
he was
Dada, yeah.
Very influential photographer. I don't know if this is a self-portrait, but this is, looks like the Spirit here, actually. Next. And this is one of Man Ray. Man Ray made a lot of experimental films and took a lot of striking photographs like this. I don't know a whole lot about him, but he definitely, Eisner went, when you wanted to see movies that were not the current movies, if you want to see anything that was considered artistic or any foreign movies, you had to go to the Museum of Modern Art, and Will went there all the time, so got to see all these photographs, and was exposed to a lot of material that maybe the ordinary Bronx kid would not have been. Next, please. And this was an influence on everybody.
Yeah.
This was sort of the height. This is Orson Welles. Who starring as Charles Foster Kane in Citizen Kane, the movie he also directed at age 25. And Eisner himself had spent a lot of his youth as selling newspapers down on Wall Street, actually. But he was a newspaper kid, which was a kind of, it's a very tough job for anybody, but especially for a little kid guarding your turf. Eisner's written about that, drawn about that in some of his memoir comics. But Welles influenced everybody. Who all these guys, Eisner and Bob Kane and Kirby and Jerry Robinson, who did Batman as well. And they had all been influenced by by German Expressionist film and by the black and white films that would later become known as film noir. But Citizen Kane was a movie that had an incredible influence both in film and in comics, and that's Welles. Next, please.
Citizen Kane.
Citizen Kane. I mean, it might as well say the Spirit, on that thing. I mean, and so Eisner, and again, everybody, all these guys talk about how they were just, in the days before VCRs or DVDs or streaming, they would go and sit in the theater and watch Citizen Kane over and over and over. Next, please. So this is a famous sequence, these next three from Citizen Kane. It's a rainy night. The reporter who's kind of telling the story goes to visit Charles Kane, Foster Kane's ex-wife. Next, please. And then we see it through the rainy window, and you get that very dramatic effect of the water and the glass. Next, please. And then we are in with some skillfully done cutting and editing. we're in hearing, the drunk and angry uh, ex-wife and of the recently deceased Kane. And so here's Eisner's take on it next.
There it is.
Here's the spirit. It's a little less glamorous. It's not a nightclub. And I don't know for a fact that Will was basing this image on that Citizen Kane, but I think so. It had to have been, if it wasn't a still pinned up on his drawing board, it certainly was something in his mind. So,
Mm-hmm.
so Will was able, was influenced by the movies. I have found certainly Will would always say that he was influenced by Orson Welles. After much searching, I found one quote where somebody said that they heard that Orson Welles said he was influenced by Will Eisner. So I wouldn't take that to the bank, but that's the closest I've been able to. Because Welles was a fan of comics. Welles was influenced by comic strips, especially. There's one really weird Superman story from the 40s that guest stars Orson Welles. I think he had a movie coming out, but it was sort of a riff on War of the Worlds and that Superman. It was, you find it's a crazy story. But anyway, so Eisner brought in as much or more than anybody the influence of film to comics. Next, please.
There's a certain school of thought among some of the more purist comics fans who say, where cinematic is kind of a bad word, but it's really just in how you use it.
I get that because you sometimes, when I give my What Are Comics lecture, which I'll spare you most of, but I will raise my hands to the limit of the width of my Zoom postage stamp here, and I'll say there's text here and film or moving images here, and somewhere in the middle is comics, which shares characteristics with both media, but is its own thing.
Mm-hmm.
So as a reader and as an editor, I sometimes come across writers who think they're writing movies, and they forget that movies have, actors, motion, music, camera move. Instead of taking advantage of all the things that comics do, they try sort of a pale imitation of what movies do. I think Eisner did not. Eisner, I think, understood what he could take from movies, but what he could also take from L.Z. Seeger and Crazy Cat. He got it. So I know we've seen this image before, but I wanted to. Let me show it in the context of Black Alley. We've seen that next. And this is the story that Black Alley is part of. Next, please. So again, here's a chase scene in. With using as if he was looking at it through a camera lens that was distorting. It's just an incredible chase scene of the spirit chasing this guy, and just one of the great Eisnerian touches here is the spirit is chasing a crook on the subway, on the elevated subway tracks. But the people watching just assume if somebody that it's got to be the bad guy chasing him. Their sympathy is with the crook. Run, Mac, run! That's just like that. That's where Eisner, excelled at just those little touches. Just those that I'm breathless just looking at that scene, and it really ends 2 panels before the end of the page, and. It's just what this guy could do. Just look at that middle tier, the panel on the right. It's just so simple and yet so powerful. The overhead shot.
Yeah.
Anyway, next, please.
You can see the influence on people like Frank Miller.
Oh my God, on everybody.
Yeah.
And then that's actually, I think that may be No, I guess that's the next. That's the next, right? The next page,
Okay.
with more of that scene, and then you have the guy. The bad guy is, despite the spirit's attempt to warn him to look out, is run over. Yeah, and that, I mean, then again, and it's almost
Oops, sorry.
almost a throwaway, that bottom middle panel of just the spirit hanging on by one hand while the click 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 of the. I mean, this is, again, I can't say if Eisner invented this vocabulary. I'm sure somebody could find images like this from somebody, but putting it together like this, pretty damn good. Next, please. And
Oh,
then
my
this,
favorite.
yeah. So this was actually Will's favorite of his stories. It was called The Story of Gerhard Schnabel, and it's about a guy, a meek fellow named Gerhard Schnabel, and despite that, this is not a funny story. And he discovers as a child that he can fly, but his parents are threatened by it, and they don't want him to seem like a freak or a weirdo, so they like beat it out of him. I have the whole story here, which we don't have to linger on, but we can.
Oh, there it is.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
that's an early thing. I don't know who else in those days was using actual photo montages. But there, and I've seen several versions. I think Will reworked that page. I don't know if either the photos faded or he wasn't happy with it, but that's, and again, what he and a letterer named Abe Canixon did, to make the lettering part of the story about one day on his 8th birthday, to be exact, young Gerhard slipped and fell off a roof in midair. He twisted and turned in an effort to save himself. Suddenly, hey, Ma, look at me, I'm flying. Instead of falling, he flew gracefully to earth. So this is the story. And next, please.
Pretty sure nobody was doing that with captions back then.
Again, it's hard. There were a lot of inventive people, but nobody that so probably there's somebody who studied this with a fine tooth comb, but this is pretty damn good. I'm always hesitant with anything in comics to say nobody was doing that or he was the first, or there's always some wise guy who will go, no, in this story that came out in 1875.
I'll say nobody popular was doing that. No, I don't know.
Right.
Yeah.
So again, you can just sort of see the story. Will, it's got a humorous side to it. Next, please.
Yeah, this kind of group of old men would not have been done pre-war, right? Like, because it's too.
I don't know.
Like,
you think it's spoofing capitalism? You mean? Or?
I feel like it's a spoof of something. Yeah, definitely.
I don't know. I mean,
where they all talk at once.
That would require a better scholar than me. I think the comics were all over the place, and I guess depending on where they were published. So here's another photo of like lower Manhattan probably, and the spirit. Gerhard Schnabel blunders every street, and somebody is robbed something, and the spirit and Dolan are after them. Why the commissioner is constantly out on cases, with the spirit, who is a vigilante, I don't know, but don't ask, but Gerhard Schnabel here is just thinking he's sick of being repressed by his parents, by his bosses. He's going to fly. So the spirit is chasing the bad guys. Doesn't even notice Schnabel. And again, those are the days when elevators needed elevator operators. There were very few or no self-service elevators. Next. And they get to the roof, and the spirit is punching it out with the bad guys. And Schnabel, nobody's noticing anybody else. And Gerhard Schnabel, there's a big crowd below. They'll see me and I'll be famous. Now that bottom panel of him leaping off the roof, I think I've seen that swiped half a dozen times in various comics over the years. I mean, that's, that panel is famous, not necessarily on its own, which it is, but because of how many people have homage / just swiped it. Next, please.
Oops.
And you spoiled the end. You gave the ending of this 65-year-old story away. So Schnabel flies, and he's finally happy. but the gangsters are still shooting it out with the spirit, and Schnabel comes around the bend. Next, please. And accidentally gets winged. Nobody notices, and so lifeless Gerhard Schnabel fluttered earthward. But do not weep for Schnabel, rather shed a tear for all mankind. For not one person in the entire crowd that watched his body being carted away knew or even suspected that on this day Gerhard Schnabel had flown. There's a theory that I think Will actually agreed with, that one of the reasons that this was his favorite was maybe he himself felt that all those years when he was just doing the corporate and military stuff, that he wasn't really showing his talents to their utmost, and that he was just sort of keeping himself hidden like Schnabel, and that's why he related so much to this story. That is a theory that I think Will has agreed, is part of the appeal. Next, please. This is, we've mentioned his name many times, Jules Pfeiffer. It's not when he was working for Will, which was when he was a teenager and in his 20s, but it's probably when he was maybe in his late 20s or early 30s, working on one of his own strips, one of his famous Pfeiffer strips. And so Jules, a lot of you may know him as a screenwriter, a playwright, a writer of children's books. He's just recently did a trilogy of graphic novels, which are very Eisner inspired. We'll look at it a little bit later. Anyway, that's Jules Pfeiffer. Next. And this is a story from from 1950, which, again, Pfeiffer and Eisner collaborated on a lot of things. And I think that in later years, people have sat with them and gone through printed stories and say who did what, and they never agree who did what, and not necessarily to hog credit, but to give credit to they had a very symbiotic relationship. So this allegedly is New Year's Eve. Obviously it was drawn months before, but it's the spirit that came out on New Year's Eve 1950, and the conceit is that it's and look at this, it's Eisner is late on his deadline, so he's going into the office to work on the spirit, which is in this case is the sign on the door, and when the door is closed, it's backwards on the glass. I mean, it's an incredible page. Now all I need is a good New Year's story. No, oh ho hum. Okay, next page. Eisner has fallen asleep, and his jealous evil assistant sneaks in, who Eisner drew not only to look like Pfeiffer, but a really unflattering view of Pfeiffer. And he comes in and shoots the sleeping Eisner in the back, and then the phone rings, and it's the newspaper wanting the spirit story. So the character, who is not Jules Pfeiffer, for years, all I've been doing is sharpening pencils, erasing pages, and drawing little children's pictures. I am better than all this. No more little children for me. I will draw a spirit story, the like of which the world has never seen. Next page. This is a color close-up of just how of that awful caricature. Next. And this is what Jules was doing, a kid strip called Clifford, which oddly enough was made into a movie with Martin Short 15 years ago. So in comics, nothing ever dies or goes away forever. Anyway, Clifford was a humorous strip starring a kid named Clifford, but here some combination of Jules and Will combined to come up with Clifford as the spirit, with a yo-yo and stuff blowing up, and him saying, I must be the spirit. I must never carry a gun, but still I must fight crime barehanded. No other crime fighter can make that stupid statement. So it's almost Mad Magazine. It's almost as it's almost Harvey, and it's Pfeiffer.
Predates Kurtzman, yeah.
Yeah, predates the Kurtzman Mad, maybe not the Kurtzman Hey.
Not look. Kurtzman, yeah.
And, I mean, look, and it's got all the noirish, spirit hallmarks. It's got the logo that's turning into rain. Yeah. It's got the old school antique lampo. I mean, it's very. So this is the kind of thing that made the spirit different. Next, please. Then near the end, um, I'm not even sure how much Will. This was literally the last story arc of the Spirit, written by Pfeiffer. And I guess it's, I think it's true with any comic book, a comic strip character. When you can't figure out what to do and sales are tanking, you send them to outer space. Maybe that tradition started here with, and I mean, Wally Wood was drawing it.
Yeah.
Pfeiffer was scripting it. I think Will was still supervising and editing and contributing, but this was literally the end of the line. He was about to or had gotten married. He, I think, just was starting a new phase. Next. So then in this, and Will picked whether intentionally or not, he picked a good time to kind of get out of the, I mean, actually, Will had not made monthly comics since 1940. He'd done some packaging after that, but really he was out of that mainstream, what Lee and Kirby and all those, people were doing. And this was the era of EC Comics, which also published Mad, but published horror comics and crime comics that were very violent for the time for him, became very controversial. And so Will actually chose a good time to not be in the business. Next, please. And this was a guy named Frederick Wortham, who was one of the main crusaders against comics. He was a Austrian psychiatrist who came to New York, he was Jewish, but he came to New York not as a refugee. He came in the 1920s to study psychiatry at Johns Hopkins University, and stayed and became a pop culture critic and expert and took aim at comics. And again, that's a whole other presentation, but was in many ways, along with the advent of television, was responsible for comics which had been selling literally in the billions in the 1950s, imploding, and the institution of the Comics Code. If we're talking about Jewish content and Jewish creators, next please, one thing that did come out of all that, one of the few stories to address the Holocaust at all in the post-war years was a story called Master Race. And it was written by Al Feldstein and drawn by a visionary cartoonist named Bernard Krigstein. And this is about a death camp survivor and the commandant of the camp who escaped justice, meeting in the New York subways. But this is regarded as one of the high points in comics ever. You can see Krigstein wasn't just batting out comics for page rate. He was doing all sorts of things with abstraction and layout and breaking time up into segments. That was pretty revolutionary. And in the content, it was, as I said, it was another 10 years, probably required mouse coming out for comics to really address the existence of the Holocaust at all. It's not so, it relates to Eisner in the sense that this was an early sign that maybe comics could be more than superheroes punching each other. Next, please. And so as a result of all this stuff, and if you know the history, good, but I've been going on too long already, so not, but essentially the superheroes, comics imploded in the 50s. They started coming back. The superheroes came back, starting more or less with The Flash in 1956 at DC. And, Eisner was still doing his instructional stuff, his military stuff. This was not, next please, we can see a picture of Will. And there was Will. I mean, I guess he was already doing some things with the Spirit, obviously, but this is more or less, he'd lost that hair that he had in those early pictures in the 40s. And he was a businessman, but that didn't mean he still wasn't working in an office with like an exposed radiator. There was still comics. And next please, he was doing PS Magazine, which was a successor. And as we had said, he discovered that among things soldiers like to look at is scantily clad women. So, the joke here is that I guess she is Connie Rod.
Yeah.
That name, but Connie Rod is apparently running the car wash detail, and these guys are all eager to join her in the car wash. So this is what Will was doing, and sort of making a nice living at it, and he was not prey to all the insanity going on with Wortham and the business imploding or not, or expanding, or this was not Will Eisner's concern. Next, please. So I've been going on a long time. So
it's cool.
This was the again, just more of the kind of material Will was doing. Somehow he's humorously getting across how to grease your engine. Everybody knows you only need a grease job every 1,000 miles, which sounds kind of dirty, but Joe, we've been anyway. So this is what Will Eisner was doing, and but then next, please. More of the same. This is more sex and car repair. Next.
Sex and car repairs. I love it.
Will would always try. He was always, game, so to speak, to try something new. He and Pfeiffer, I think, they tried a comic called Baseball Comics, which I think lasted either 1 or 2 issues. Next, please. At some point, actually, while he was doing the graphic novels, he was just. I'm sure he would love to have made money on these things, but I think he had a mind that just wanted to do stuff. So here's Will. He had a lot of these guides to communicating with your plans. Will Eisner's Guide to Astrology. He was at a weird period because I think because of Pfeiffer and because of the underground, I think he was being rediscovered, but he didn't quite know what to do with that new fame. So he was doing all this strange stuff. And then next, please. And people know emerging eras. I'm kind of telescoping things that happened in the 60s and 70s. This is the great comic book heroes I talk about, the book by Pfeiffer. It was the holiday gift of 1965 for anybody who was a comic fan. This was because again we had never seen Joe Shuster's artwork on Superman. We'd never seen, Bob Kane's. I mean, maybe we'd seen some annuals, but not in context and not the 40s stuff. It's just mind blowing. And compiled, introduced, and annotated. Pfeiffer's text in this is hilarious and very full of historic information. Next, please. This is the story I was telling you about. This is the Jewel of Death. It was the spirit story that was reprinted in Great Comic Book Heroes. Nobody that I knew, no kid that I knew had seen it or any idea what it was. He's in an Egyptian bazaar. He's wearing a white suit, which is odd. I don't know if I ever saw the kid wear a white suit. It's like a Casablanca. I guess it's Eisner's take on Casablanca. Oh, no, wait a minute.
It can't be. It came out before Casablanca.
The year before Casablanca. Casablanca is Bogart's take on The Spirit. And Michael Curtiz's and the Epstein brothers. But this is, I had never, as much as I loved, Lee and Kirby and Ditko and Steranko, and it was a little before Steranko, but as much as I loved all that stuff, something about this really, this did precisely what Pfeiffer wanted, was it put Eisner back on the map, and people went, where do I find out more about this guy? Next, please. The same era, just to give you some context again, it was the era of the Batman TV show in the mid-60s, in 66 and 67. Next. There was a Superman musical on Broadway that I went to.
Mm-hmm. Any good?
No, terrible. Was it good? It was weird because it wasn't that much about Superman. In retrospect, I guess because to have somebody fly on a Broadway stage in those days must have been very difficult and expensive and terrifying, So it was mostly about a character played by Jack Cassidy, who was the father of Sean Cassidy. His father, you're too young for any of this. Who was the Cassidy who was the big singer in the 70s? Anyway, this is his father.
One of the monkeys?
No, no, no.
No.
He was a big star, and a lot. All anyway. His father was the star, so that it was mostly about this character, a reporter from the Daily Planet that wasn't from the comics. So the story, and then there was Superman and Lois Lane, but very little of that. So I was disappointed. It was written, actually, the play was written by Newman and Benton, who, like, the next year would become famous as the screenwriters of Bonnie and Clyde. But this, so I mean, look, I was 13 or whatever I was, and it was fun, and my dad took the day off and took me, so I enjoyed it on that level. But I was really puzzled by why a show called "It's a Birds of Planet Superman" hardly had any Superman.
Okay.
So anyway, that
Oops.
next, and right around this period is when Eisner did this. I think it was early '66, so the election must have been '65. And it refers to Mayor Lindsay, who was the mayor of New York. I'm sure there's a story about how Will got to do a spirit story that lampooned local New York politics. It was part of I know that the Herald Tribune that week had a whole series of articles about comics. It might even have been, if not that issue, then around that period when Nat Friedland's article about a plot conference between Lee and Kirby that really, put a monkey wrench in their relationship. It might have even been the same issue. So there was this sense that comics were popular, comics-based entertainment was popular, and maybe somewhere in there was a place for the spirit, although I don't think he was eager to do a revival. Next, please. Harvey Comics, which put out, is best known for like Casper the Friendly Ghost and
Richie Rich.
Had a superhero line in the 40s and 50s, and I think one of the more gory horror lines, I think. And Will made a deal with them. I'm not sure the details about reprinting a bunch of the classic spirit stories. So he did a new cover. And they're absolutely boss stories, which was a expression that we used. I never used, but was in use in the 60s. Next, please.
Some boss. That's been used recently. I didn't realize people used it back then.
It's probably retro and came back. So this is Will with Dennis Kitchen, who was the founder of Kitchen Sink Press. And although Jim Warren did reprint the Spirit for a while, Kitchen really had started the reprints, and then when Warren stopped printing them, got it back. They were, Kitchen is very involved with the Eisner estate. He represents Will's work, and they were good friends. And he was one of the first people. Will knew there were these underground comics, and he went to a comic convention in New York where he met Dennis and he met Art Spiegelman and S. Clay Wilson. He met a lot of the first and second generation underground people. And the lesson he learned from that was there are comic books coming out. Will was not going to do wild and crazy drug and sex and rock and roll underground comics, but there's an audience of people that understand how to read comic books and like reading comic books, but don't have any interest in superheroes and don't have any interest in Archie and Betty and Veronica. But if you gave those adults something with meat to it, with literary value, maybe they'd go for it. And that's where Will started thinking about a contract with God. Next, please. And then this is representative of, this was, maybe the most famous underground comic of the era is Robert Crumb's Zap Comics. Actually, I saw an exhibit of Crumb's work in New York a few years ago, and there's a lot more in common between Crumb and Eisner than you would think. I mean, just their approach to layout and camera angle and the figure. It's interesting to compare them, which I'm not going to do now. So next, please. And this was an issue of Snarf. I guess it was Kid by Kitchen Sink, where Will did the cover, and it read like what it is, which is a middle-aged guy trying to take what he's familiar with and what he's known for and kind of merging it with the hippie culture of the undergrounds. And it's an uncomfortable fit, but it's nice that I think Will was willing to give it a try. Next, please.
Nice that he was willing to understand what the new generation was doing.
Well, I think we'll get back to A Contract with God, which I'll keep going.
Okay.
And so from then he started for Kitchen Sink. He would do was reprinting a lot of the Spirit, and Will was doing new painted covers. So there's this, which is striking. Next, please. And this says a Eisner femme fatale, and the Spirit tied up as he often was. While still being seduced by a beautiful woman. That's a classic Spirit thing. Next, please. The Rain. Kurtzman.
It's another Spirit thing, The Rain.
An Eisner thing. Harvey Kurtzman, who invented Mad Magazine and was good friends with Will. They both taught at School of Visual Arts in the 70s. He gave that Rain. He called it Eisenspritz, which takes the German or Yiddish spritz for rain or spraying and puts Eisner's name. So it's known. I don't know if they're a trademark, but yes, it's the Spirit and Dolan, and I think they're by what looks like the Queensboro Bridge. Eisner never said the Spirit was in New York City, although it was clear he was. He called it Central City, which gave him license to not have to be accurate in every single building he drew.
Except when he's using photographs, he's using New York City, so.
Yeah, and he wasn't fooling anybody, but then nobody could say to him, "You drew the Woolworth building wrong," or whatever, or that street doesn't intersect with that street. And Kirby did the same thing, and he was calling it New York. Next, please.
Oh, hey.
So we're talking about the late 70s, and the culture is now. So the first Superman with Christopher Reeve has come out and is very popular. Next. And even
the last one,
Jack Kirby are doing what has come to be called the Silver Surfer graphic novel. As you can see, when it first came out, actually the left is Kirby's cover that wasn't used. They ended up using a painting, I think, by Bob Larkin. And it's called The Silver Surfer, The Ultimate Cosmic Experience. In retrospect, it's now known as the Silver Surfer graphic novel, but it was a full-length Surfer story. It was actually copywritten. The copyright was to Lee and Kirby, not to Marvel.
Really?
Series of reasons, yeah.
Is that why it's never been reprinted?
Has it really never been reprinted?
I believe it's never been reprinted, yeah.
Maybe that's why. I think there's a lot of myths and legends. I think the idea was, that's why the Fantastic Four are not in it. Even though they're part of the original origin of the Surfer, and obviously when Galactus first appeared. I think there was talk of doing a Surfer movie, and then Stan owed work to Simon and Schuster, and Kirby owed work to Marvel. It was some weird, yet another convoluted, period in their relationship. But I think the idea was, if they did this with their own copyright, then if they did make a movie, they'd have to include them in the deal. I don't know if any lawyer actually told them that, or if this is just but somehow it's not copyrighted to Marvel. It's copyrighted to, but maybe you're right. Maybe, although you would have to think that if you get enough lawyers in the room, maybe they can figure out how to reprint it, because I think people, that's interesting. I didn't know it hasn't been, it's certainly available, as a used edition. So this is the era. So next,
if it has been reprinted, the reprint is also out of print.
Okay, and so this was the original cover that I talked about of Contract with God. This was printed by a small publisher, a friend of Will's. As I said, Will subsidized it. He was comfortable enough that he could spend, a year working on a project like this.